1,500 years ago, the Roman philosopher Boethius told us, indeed, the condition of human nature is just this. Man towers above the rest of creation so long as he realizes his own nature, and when he forgets it, he sinks lower than the beasts. For other living things to be ignorant of themselves is natural, but for man it is a defect. There is this daft idea mesmerizing the business world that you can round up the managers of any company plagued by a negative culture, corral them for a couple of days, training them to delegate, manage conflict, deal with difficult people, communicate effectively, and so on, and then release them back into the workplace to transform things with inspirational leadership. That this daft idea never translates into concrete reality should surprise no one. But of course it does, and all the hand-wringing about the lack of return on investment in leadership training goes on. What is the reality that the devotees of this daft idea refuse to countenance? In a nutshell, if you want to inspire people to be the best they can be in working together for the good of all, then the bedrock requirements are a well-informed intellect, that is, the capacity to think both analytically and creatively, and moral integrity, that is, a virtuous character. In other words, leaders must be properly educated before skills training can have the desired effect. Without the wisdom built by education, skills are widely abused, misused, or left unused. Boethius correctly identified the fundamental defect that has corrupted human potential for as long as civilization has existed. It should surprise no one that the global leadership crisis has coincided with the decline in the reading of history and classic literature over the past half-century and more. There are many aspects to a proper education, but the reading of classic literature and history remains the essential core. As the great science fiction writer Ray Bradbury said, "I don't believe in colleges and universities. I believe in libraries, because most students don't have any money. When I graduated from high school, it was during the Depression, and we had no money. I couldn't go to college, so I went to the library 3 days a week for 10 years. One of the most edifying books ever written on education is E.D. Hirsch's Cultural Literacy, in which he exposed the misguided ideas that have sabotaged educational achievement from the 1960s onwards. Since that time, the amount of money spent on government schooling has kept going up, while academic achievement has declined, showing no consistent signs of recovery, even in the case of charter schools and areas that have experimented with voucher systems. Explaining the fundamental error, Hirsch maintains the achievement gap is chiefly a knowledge gap and a vocabulary gap. The disastrous wrong turn in education in the 1960s, inspired by Rousseau, Piaget, and Dewey, instituted the era of child-centered learning, in which children are encouraged to construct their own knowledge based on their individual interests. Proponents argue that children have to learn how to learn and to think for themselves instead of merely having their heads stuffed with facts. In an influential discourse written in 1993, the title of which trumpeted the need for teachers to change from sage on the stage to guide on the side, Alison King, an associate professor of education at California State University, made the case for child-centered learning. According to the current constructivist theory of learning, knowledge does not come packaged in books or journals or computer disks or professors' and students' heads, to be transmitted intact from one to another. Those vessels contain information, not knowledge. Rather, knowledge is a state of understanding and can only exist in the mind of the individual knower. As such, knowledge must be constructed or reconstructed by each individual knower through the process of trying to make sense of new information in terms of what the individual already knows. Now, this all sounds very good, but it had and continues to have deleterious effects on the intellectual development of young people in most Western countries, and goes a long way to explain both the moral confusion and the leadership crisis suffocating Western society. Quite apart from the fact that a good teacher needs to be both a sage on the stage and a guide on the side, educational research supports common sense in recognizing reading comprehension as the key factor in gauging a person's intellectual acuity and his or her readiness for more advanced studies or practically any kind of employment other than the most basic manual labor. And reading proficiency is precisely the area that exposes the failure of state schooling. Bear in mind also that reading proficiency is necessary for success in mathematics and science as well. As Hugh Blair, the 18th century rhetorician, noted, when we are employed in the study of composition, we are cultivating reason itself. True rhetoric and sound logic are very closely allied. The study of arranging and expressing our thoughts with propriety teaches us to think, as well as speak, accurately. I had endless arguments with colleagues and parents on these issues while teaching in the 1970s, at a time when history was slowly being marginalized in the curriculum and literature classes steadily jettisoned classic texts in favor of contemporary books that were deemed more relevant. My central concern for students at that stage of my own intellectual development was not so much the very vital transmission of a cultural heritage, but rather providing them with the factual content and general knowledge without which reading proficiency and thinking for oneself inevitably stall. I saw my role as helping young people fill what I called their cultural reservoir, in order that they might construct a properly informed and rational worldview as the necessary foundation for thinking gainfully on any subject. As G.K. Chesterton put it, thinking means connecting things, and it stops if they cannot be connected. More content, more connections, better thinking. This is precisely the point that Hirsch developed in his books Cultural Literacy and the Knowledge Deficit. Cognitive science and psycholinguistics endorse his view that factual knowledge is essential in the ongoing development of reading and comprehension abilities. Children who enter the school system with limited vocabulary and poor general knowledge are at a grave disadvantage to peers who come from a home background in which reading, storytelling, conversation, and singing are part of everyday life. A school that eschews content-based teaching widens that gap until it becomes an abyss. In an appendix to Cultural Literacy, Hirsch put forward around 4,000 concepts that he believed all Americans should know if they were to be considered literate. Concepts like 1492, the Aeneid, a bad workman blames his tools, carbon dating, Charlemagne, DNA, the Enlightenment, eugenics, Dostoevsky, familiarity breeds contempt, the Good Samaritan, Iago, IRA, Jingoism, Kafka, making mountains out of molehills, Renoir, Robespierre, serfdom, thermodynamics, Vikings, the wasteland, and serving either God or mammon are concepts that fuel the mind for creative reasoning and continuing development. In his latest book, Why Knowledge Matters, Hirsch devotes an entire chapter to showing how schooling in France has provided damning evidence of the folly of the constructivist theory of education. In 1989, Lionel Jospin, the Minister of Education in Mitterrand's government, trashed one of the most successful elementary school curricula in the world and instructed primary schools to design their own locally relevant curricula focusing on the individual interests of the children. French traditional culture was to have no privileged status in the new curricula, and the assimilation of new immigrants became well nigh impossible. The common curriculum and universal standards were consigned to history. Fortunately, the retention of the old national assessment system, together with fastidious record-keeping bureaucrats, documented the extent of the disaster inflicted on several generations and the French economy by Jospin's misguided determination to emulate the constructivist model employed in the United States. To the dismay of the educationists, with practically every other factor remaining constant, it was plain that the dramatic drop in performance levels was the result of the revised curricula. As Hirsch puts it, they reported an astonishingly steep decline in achievement in each demographic group. Each group was academically harmed by the new system, and the harm became ever greater as one went down the economic scale. The children of the unemployed declined most of all. Achievement decreased. Inequality increased dramatically. These results from the most definitive comparative study of curriculum effects ever undertaken in any country are unambiguous and irrefutable. But don't hold your breath waiting for the establishment in any Western country to act on this robust scientific conclusion. Because curriculum is control, the essential aim of state schooling. Content, what is fed into young minds, is what shapes their worldview, and therefore how they think about things in general. Governments and corporates who claim they want young people who can think for themselves, creative and questioning, are lying. Or else they simply do not understand that education is not about technology and teacher-pupil ratios, but about content and character. Anyway, why would misleaders want to develop real leaders? Miguel Monjardino, a professor of geopolitics at the Catholic University of Portugal, has designed a 4-year program based on reading selected Greek classics to help prepare high school students for university. The program is called The Republic, a word that reflects what happens in the weekly 2-hour seminars, monthly walks in the hills, 3 formal dinners, and the annual public readings of the Iliad or the Odyssey. Students come from diverse backgrounds, the vast majority going on to acquire science, technology, engineering, or mathematics degrees. Despite fears that Greek classics would prove too demanding for teenagers, the program has been a huge success, with past participants expressing profound gratitude for the positive impact on their lives. Monjardino has never encountered indifference in any student on the program, and once the initial obstacles of undernourished vocabularies and digital age attention spans are overcome, the intellectual and emotional development of the young people is both rapid and robust. Reflecting on the reading of the Iliad, Monjardino explains, our early conversations are about ideas like power, authority, honor, love, shame, and command. The first disagreement comes quickly. On one side are the students who believe that Agamemnon is right. Leadership for them is about power, privilege, and domination. On the other side are those who feel, at least at the beginning of the Iliad, that Achilles is the true leader of the expedition. Men respect him and listen to him. Leadership for this group is about personal honor, example, and sacrifice. We disagree, said a perplexed student. We have different opinions. To their surprise, the class realized that they had a profound difference over something important, which forced them to think. Monjardino states the reality plainly. History and philosophy matter. There is no statecraft without them. Thucydides and Plato knew this, but we seem to have forgotten it. Nevertheless, I'm betting that in the years ahead, our readings and conversations will help these students defend the virtues of a free society in a world that will go through great changes, just as Athens did. G.K. Chesterton also expressed these realities in all his grist. Anyhow, that is what is the matter with business education, that it narrows the mind, whereas the whole object of education is to broaden the mind, and especially to broaden it so as to enable it to criticize and condemn such narrowness. Everybody ought to learn first a general view of the history of man, of the nature of man, and, as I for one should add, of the nature of God. This may enable him to consider the rights and wrongs of slavery in a slave community, of cannibalism in a cannibal community, or of commerce in a commercial community. If he is immediately initiated into the mysteries of these institutions themselves, if he is sworn in infancy to take them as seriously as they take themselves, if he becomes a trader not only before he becomes a traveler, but even before he becomes a true citizen of his own town, he will never be able to denounce these institutions, or even to improve them. Such a state will never have the ideas or imagination to reform itself, and hustle and bustle and business activity will have resulted in the dead fixity of a fossil. Having repudiated its history and culture, the West today is geared to produce misleaders, ideologically engineered men and women bent on promoting the narrow agendas of special interests. Leadership will not be restored without a return to true education, the kind that develops wisdom and virtue, the kind that demands a well-informed mind shaped by a broad knowledge of history and classic literature. As should be obvious to any educated mind, knowledge and virtue are essential if freedom is to flourish. It is also true that leadership is only necessary when a society is free. Unfree societies are typically ruled by oligarchs or dictators, that is, misleaders. All of us should be alarmed not merely by the waning of liberty and the rule of law, but by the apathetic response of the general public in the face of the oligarchic power grab. As Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to Charles Yancey, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be.